The search team leader froze mid-step, his radio crackling uselessly in his trembling hand as he stared at the impossible scene before him. After 72 hours in the Montana wilderness, Jacob Mitchell should have been dead, dehydrated, hypothermic, devoured by wildlife. Instead, the paralyzed 70-year-old veteran lay peacefully beside a freshwater stream, covered by pine boughs arranged with military precision, while a massive German shepherd stood guard like a furry sentinel. "Jesus Christ!" whispered paramedic Sarah Chen, her medical bag slipping from nerveless fingers as she took in the sight. The dog's amber eyes held an intelligence that made her skin crawl. This wasn't some lucky coincidence. Tom Bradley, the neighbor who'd organized the search, felt his knees buckle as recognition hit him like a physical blow. Those dog tags glinting in the afternoon sun, that distinctive white blaze across the muzzle. He'd seen this animal before, in a framed photo on Margaret Mitchell's mantelpiece, standing beside her dead son in Afghanistan. "Radio base camp," Tom commanded, his voice barely steady. "Tell them we found Jacob alive, and tell them to bring a veterinarian." How had a dead soldier's dog found his father in thousands of acres of wilderness? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 3 years earlier, Jacob Mitchell had been the kind of man who could frame a house in a day and still have energy to teach his grandson how to whittle. His calloused hands had built half the homes in Whitefish, Montana, each one a testament to 40 years of precision carpentry. Veterans from 3 wars sought him out not just for his craftsmanship, but for the quiet understanding in his steel-gray eyes, the look of a man who'd seen combat and come home whole. The stroke changed everything in the space of a heartbeat. Margaret had been folding his army dress uniform when she heard the crash from the workshop. She found him collapsed beside his workbench, his right side already slack, eyes wide with the terror of a mind trapped in a failing body. The man who'd survived the Tet Offensive couldn't lift a coffee cup. The carpenter who'd built their dream home couldn't grip a pencil. 43 years of marriage, Margaret whispered to her reflection in the hospital bathroom mirror, her once auburn hair now streaked with premature silver. For better or worse, in sickness and health. The words felt like stones in her mouth. At 64, she'd become a full-time nurse to a man who looked at her with such grateful love that it broke her heart daily. The medical bills devoured their savings like wildfire. $400,000 in the first year alone, enough to buy 3 houses outright. Their Victorian home, Jacob's pride and joy, now carried a second mortgage that kept Margaret awake at night, calculating and recalculating numbers that never added up to hope. But the money wasn't the worst part. The worst part was watching Jacob disappear piece by piece, his carpenter's precision reduced to trembling attempts to button his shirt. He'd been a man who fixed things, built things, created beauty from raw lumber. Now he couldn't even feed himself without help. Margaret had been an army nurse before Jacob swept her off her feet with his shy smile and steady hands. She knew suffering intimately, had held dying soldiers and whispered comfort to boys calling for their mothers. But this was different. This was watching the man she'd loved for 4 decades fade away, one frustrated grunt and apologetic look at a time. Their son Jacob Jr., JJ, to everyone who knew him, had inherited his father's steady nature and his mother's fierce loyalty. When he'd enlisted after 9/11, they'd been proud but terrified. Afghanistan claimed him 3 years ago, an IED that left nothing to bury except a flag and a handful of personal effects that still sat unopened in Margaret's bedroom closet. The grief had nearly destroyed them both. Jacob retreated into his workshop, building birdhouses with obsessive precision. Margaret threw herself into volunteer work at the VA hospital, anything to avoid the silence in their too-empty house. They were still recovering from losing their only child when the stroke stole their future, leaving them prisoners in a life neither had chosen. Their neighbor Tom Bradley watched it all with the careful attention of an old soldier who recognized a family under siege. The morning of September 15th started like any other nightmare. Margaret stood in their bedroom doorway at 5:47 a.m., watching Jacob sleep fitfully in the hospital bed that had replaced their antique four-poster. His breathing was labored, each exhale a small surrender. The man who'd once carried her over the threshold of this very room now weighed barely 140 pounds, his frame hollowed out by 3 years of immobility. She'd found the letter the night before. Hidden beneath a stack of unpaid medical bills, Jacob's shaky handwriting spelled out words that cut deeper than any scalpel. My dearest Maggie, I can't watch you sacrifice your life for what's left of mine. You deserve to dance again, to laugh without guilt, to sleep through the night without listening for my breathing. Forgive me for being too much of a coward to say goodbye properly. He'd never sent it. Maybe he couldn't reach the mailbox, or maybe some part of him still hoped. But Margaret had read those words over and over until they burned themselves into her memory. Her husband wanted to die, had wanted to die for months, maybe years. The decision crystallized with terrible clarity. She would give him what he wanted, what they both needed. Margaret loaded Jacob into their modified van with the mechanical efficiency of a nurse completing rounds. The wheelchair lift groaned under his weight, a sound that had become the soundtrack of their diminished life. Jacob's eyes tracked her movements, questioning but trusting. He'd always trusted her completely. Where are we going, sweetheart? His words came slowly, slurred but understandable. For a drive, she said, forcing brightness into her voice. Remember how we used to drive up to Glacier Park? You loved those mountain views. Jacob's smile was lopsided but genuine. Those drives had been their ritual during better times, when his hands were strong enough to hold hers, when conversation flowed like the streams they'd follow into the wilderness. The 2-hour drive to Glacier National Park passed in relative silence. Margaret had disabled the GPS and left her phone at home. No digital breadcrumbs to follow, no way for anyone to track their final journey together. She'd thought of everything, almost everything. At the trailhead parking area, she noticed the dog immediately. A large German shepherd sat perfectly still beside a dented pickup truck, his amber eyes focused on something only he could see. His coat was thick and well-maintained despite obvious signs of living rough. Matted fur around the collar, mud caked on his paws. Around his neck hung military dog tags that caught the afternoon sunlight. Beautiful animal, Jacob observed, his speech clearer when he was interested in something. The dog's ears perked at the sound of his voice, head tilting with obvious intelligence. Margaret barely glanced at the animal. She had more pressing concerns. The trail she'd chosen wound through dense forest for half a mile before opening onto a scenic overlook, deep enough to ensure Jacob wouldn't be found quickly, remote enough that his death would look like a tragic accident, an elderly man who'd somehow wandered off and gotten lost. The manual wheelchair bumped and jarred over the uneven trail. Each jolt sent tremors through Jacob's frail body, but he endured it without complaint, just as he'd endured everything else. His eyes drank in the towering pines, the patches of late summer wildflowers, the clean mountain air that tasted of freedom. This is far enough, Margaret said when they reached a small clearing dominated by an ancient Douglas fir. Her voice sounded strange in her own ears, hollow, distant. She set the wheelchair brake and walked around to face her husband. Jacob looked up at her with those gray eyes that had seen too much war, too much loss, too much of everything except peace. Maggie, he said softly, I know. The words hit her like a physical blow. Of course he knew. Jacob had always been able to read her better than she could read herself. 43 years of marriage didn't end without recognition, without understanding. "I can't do this anymore," she whispered, the admission torn from somewhere deep in her chest. "I can't watch you disappear. I can't keep pretending we're going to be okay." "I know," he repeated, and there was forgiveness in those two simple words. Forgiveness and love and a terrible kind of relief. Margaret turned the wheelchair so Jacob faced the view. Mountains stretching to the horizon, peaks touched with early snow, the kind of vista they'd shared in happier times. Then she released the brake and began the long walk back to the parking lot, each step heavier than the last. She didn't look back. She couldn't. Behind her, the German shepherd with the military tag stood up, stretched once, and padded silently into the forest toward the man who'd been left to die. Rex had been tracking the scent for 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days. The trail was faint but unmistakable, a combination of Old Spice aftershave, sawdust, and something deeper, more fundamental. The same scent that had clung to the letters his handler used to read aloud in their tent during quiet moments between patrols. Letters from home, from a father who wrote about building cabinets and fixing the neighbor's fence, who always ended with, "Tell JJ, his old man is proud of him." Rex approached the clearing with the tactical awareness drilled into him through years of military service. His nose catalogued the scene, fear sweat from the woman who'd just left, the metallic tang of medications, and underneath it all, that achingly familiar scent that had haunted his dreams since Kandahar. The man in the wheelchair sat motionless, staring out at the mountain vista, with the same 1,000-yard stare Rex had seen on countless soldiers' faces. But when their eyes met, something electric passed between them, recognition that transcended species and circumstances. "Well, I'll be damned," Jacob whispered, his voice barely audible in the mountain silence. "You're real." Rex tilted his head, studying the man's features. The bone structure was right, the jawline familiar. This was the father JJ had described in meticulous detail during those long desert nights. "Built like a brick shithouse, but gentle as a lamb," JJ had said. "Taught me everything worth knowing about being a man." The dog approached slowly, non-threateningly, the way he'd been trained to approach wounded soldiers. As he drew closer, his enhanced senses picked up details that painted a devastating picture. The slight odor of unwashed clothing, the medicinal smell of bed sores, the bitter scent of despair that seemed to emanate from Jacob's pores. Jacob's left hand, the one with limited movement, trembled as he raised it toward Rex. The dog allowed the touch, felt the papery skin and weakened grip that had once wielded hammers and saws with legendary precision. On Jacob's forearm, partially hidden by his sleeve, Rex glimpsed the edge of a tattoo, the distinctive eagle, globe, and anchor of the Marine Corps. "You served too," Jacob observed, his words slurred but clear enough. His eyes had focused on Rex's dog tags, noting the military precision of their arrangement. "Afghanistan?" Rex sat perfectly still, his body language communicating volumes. Yes, he'd served. Yes, he'd lost his handler. Yes, he understood the weight of survival when others didn't make it home. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks, painting the clearing in shades of gold and amber. Temperature would drop rapidly once darkness fell. Rex's survival training kicked in automatically. This man wouldn't last the night in his current condition, not without help. But something about Jacob's posture, the resigned set of his shoulders, suggested he wasn't planning to try. "She didn't want to leave me," Jacob said quietly, speaking to Rex as if the dog could understand every word. 43 years, and I finally broke her, made her choose between her life and mine." His laugh was bitter, self-recriminating. "Guess I know which one won." Rex's ears flattened slightly. He'd heard that tone before, in the voices of soldiers who'd given up hope. But JJ had never talked about his father like that. The man JJ described was a fighter, someone who'd built a life from nothing and held his family together through pure force of will. The first twist came when Rex noticed the small details that revealed Jacob's true nature. Despite his physical limitations, the man had unconsciously positioned his wheelchair to provide the best tactical view of the approaches to the clearing. His eyes constantly swept the perimeter, cataloging potential threats with the automatic awareness of a trained soldier. This wasn't just a disabled man. This was a Marine who'd never stopped being a Marine. The second twist emerged when Rex caught a familiar scent on Jacob's clothing. Buried under the smell of medications and despair was something else. Gunpowder. Not recent, but embedded deep in the fabric fibers. The kind of residue that came from years of handling firearms, cleaning weapons, maybe even building custom holsters in that workshop JJ had described. The biggest twist came when Jacob spoke again, his voice carrying a strength that hadn't been there moments before. "You belonged to my boy, didn't you?" Rex's entire body went rigid. How could he know? Jacob's good hand moved to his shirt pocket, extracting a small, worn photograph. With obvious difficulty, he held it out for Rex to see. The image showed a young Marine in desert camouflage, grinning at the camera with his arm around a German shepherd. JJ and Rex, taken 3 months before the IED changed everything. "He wrote about you," Jacob continued, his voice breaking slightly. "Said you were the best partner he'd ever had. Said you'd watch each other's backs no matter what." Jacob's eyes met Rex's again, and this time they held a different kind of recognition, not just of similarity, but of shared loss. "He never made it home to introduce us properly." Rex whined softly, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his throat. The pieces were falling into place with devastating clarity. This wasn't just any abandoned man, this was JJ's father, the hero his handler had spoken of with such obvious love and respect. And Rex had found him, here in this remote clearing, just when both of them needed each other most. The first night tested them both in ways neither had expected. Rex's military training kicked in as temperatures began dropping with the mountain sunset. He'd survived in hostile terrain before, but never with a disabled civilian who couldn't contribute to his own survival. The dog began by dragging fallen pine boughs toward Jacob's wheelchair, using his teeth to arrange them in a windbreak pattern he'd learned during winter survival exercises in Colorado. Jacob watched this display of tactical intelligence with growing amazement. "You're not just following instincts, are you?" he murmured. "Someone taught you this." Rex paused in his work, meeting Jacob's eyes directly. The communication between them was wordless but profound. Two veterans recognizing each other's expertise. Jacob began directing Rex's efforts with small gestures and quiet words, his Marine training asserting itself despite his physical limitations. "There," Jacob pointed with his functioning hand toward a depression near the base of the large Douglas fir, natural shelter, wind protection. Working together, they created a survival shelter that would have impressed any drill instructor. Rex provided the physical capability while Jacob supplied the tactical knowledge, their partnership falling into place with the seamless efficiency of a well-trained unit. As darkness settled over the mountains, Rex positioned himself between Jacob and the forest, his body tense with alertness. His enhanced hearing picked up every sound, the crack of cooling wood, the rustle of small animals, and something else, something larger moving through the underbrush with deliberate stealth. The black bear emerged from the tree line around midnight. Rex smelled it long before it appeared, a massive male, probably 300 pounds, drawn by the unfamiliar scents in his territory. The dog's lips pulled back in a silent snarl, every muscle coiled for action. This was the moment when his PTSD could have triggered, when the sounds and smells of violence might have sent him into a flashback spiral. Instead, Rex felt only crystalline clarity. He had a mission again. He had someone to protect. The bear rose on its hind legs, testing the air, trying to determine if these intruders represented threat or opportunity. Rex stepped forward, placing himself directly between the predator and Jacob, his hackles raised to make himself appear larger. "Easy, boy," Jacob whispered, his voice steady despite the obvious danger. "You've got this." Those 3 words, delivered with the confidence of a man who'd faced worse threats in Vietnamese jungles, gave Rex exactly what he needed. The dog advanced on the bear with calculated aggression, not attacking, but establishing dominance through sheer force of will. His growl was low and threatening, carrying all the authority of a military working dog who'd faced insurgents and survived. The bear, confronted by an opponent who showed no fear, dropped to all fours and shuffled away into the darkness. Rex held his position until the sounds of retreat faded completely, then returned to Jacob's side, settling against the wheelchair with the satisfied air of a job well done. "Good boy," Jacob said softly, his functioning hand finding Rex's head in the darkness. "JJ would be proud." Meanwhile, 40 miles away in Whitefish, Margaret was discovering that escape from guilt wasn't as simple as driving away. She sat in her kitchen, Jacob's coffee mug still unwashed in the sink, staring at the pill bottle in her hands. 30 OxyContin tablets, left over from Jacob's worst days after the stroke, enough to ensure she'd never have to face what she'd done, never have to explain to neighbors and friends why Jacob was suddenly absent from their lives. The house felt enormous around her, every room echoing with memories of the life they'd built together. 43 years of shared meals, shared laughter, shared sorrows. The living room where they'd danced to their wedding song on every anniversary, the kitchen where Jacob had surprised her with breakfast in bed on difficult mornings, the workshop where he'd built cribs for grandchildren they'd never had. She'd written 3 different versions of a confession, each one attempting to explain the unexplainable. How do you tell the world that love sometimes looks like abandonment? That mercy can wear the face of betrayal? The phone rang at 1:17 a.m. Tom Bradley's voice was tight with concern. "Margaret, I know it's late, but I haven't seen Jacob around. His workshop light's been off for 2 days. Is everything okay?" Margaret's prepared lies stuck in her throat. Tom was JJ's godfather, had been Jacob's best man at their wedding. He'd earned the right to honesty, even if she couldn't give it to him. "He's sleeping," she managed. "The new medication makes him drowsy." "Well, when he's up to it, tell him I found something in my garage. One of JJ's boxes that got mixed in with our stuff when we helped you clean out his apartment. Thought he might want to go through it." The line went quiet for so long that Tom wondered if the call had dropped. When Margaret finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "What kind of box?" "Military stuff, mostly. Letters he never sent, some photos, and something about a dog, Rex, I think. There's a whole folder about trying to adopt his working dog after discharge. Looks like JJ was planning to bring him home as a surprise." Margaret's breath caught. JJ had never mentioned a dog, but then there were so many things about his service that he'd kept to himself. So many stories he'd planned to tell when he came home for good. "I'll tell Jacob," she said, the words feeling like broken glass in her mouth. Back in the mountains, the second day brought new challenges and deeper connections. Rex had spent the early morning hours hunting, using skills honed during reconnaissance missions where silence meant survival. He returned to the clearing with a rabbit, which he methodically prepared in a way that made Jacob's military background suddenly relevant. "You're going to share that with me, aren't you?" Jacob asked, only half joking. His stomach had been cramping since yesterday, his body beginning the slow process of starvation. Rex dropped pieces of the fresh meat near Jacob's functioning hand, then retreated to give the man space to eat. The gesture was so deliberately considerate, so thoughtfully executed, that Jacob felt tears prick his eyes. "Your boy taught you about taking care of people," Jacob observed. "He learned that from his mother. She was always the caregiver in our family." As if summoned by the mention of caregiving, Rex approached with something else in his mouth, a cluster of service berries he'd found growing near the stream. The berries were past their prime but still edible, providing essential vitamins that would help Jacob's body process the protein. The sight of this methodical nutrition planning triggered a memory in Jacob, something JJC had mentioned in his last letter home. How his military working dog had somehow learned to identify edible plants during survival training, had even saved lives by leading lost soldiers to water sources. "Rex," Jacob said suddenly, the name feeling right on his tongue. "Your name is Rex, isn't it?" The dog's ears perked forward, his tail giving a single, controlled wag, not the enthusiastic response of a pet hearing his name, but the acknowledgement of a professional hearing his call sign. "My boy wrote about you," Jacob continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Said you were the smartest partner he'd ever worked with. Said you could read situations better than most humans." He paused, studying Rex's alert posture. "He also said you were planning to come home with him." Rex moved closer, resting his massive head against Jacob's knee. The weight was comforting, solid, real. For the first time in 3 years, Jacob felt like he had a purpose beyond simply existing. This dog, JJ's dog, needed him as much as he needed the dog. "We're going to get out of this," Jacob said with conviction he hadn't felt since before the stroke. "Both of us. We're going to go home." But as the sun reached its zenith on their second day in the wilderness, neither of them knew that Tom Bradley was already following their trail, driven by a growing certainty that Margaret's story didn't add up. Tom Bradley had learned to read lies during 3 tours in Vietnam, where false information could get your entire unit killed. Margaret's story had more holes than a rice farmer's irrigation system, and every instinct he'd honed in 50 years of military and civilian life was screaming that Jacob Mitchell was in serious trouble. He'd started his investigation the morning after Margaret's suspicious phone call, beginning with Jacob's workshop. The building still smelled of sawdust and WD-40, but something was wrong. Jacob's wheelchair, the heavy-duty model they'd bought after insurance fights that lasted months, was missing. More telling were the tire tracks in the driveway, fresh enough to have been made recently, leading toward the main road that connected to Highway 2. The GPS unit in Margaret's van told a different story than her words. Tom had learned basic digital forensics during his years as a volunteer firefighter, enough to access the device's recent destinations. The last programmed location was Glacier National Park, specifically the Going to the Sun Road trailhead, a place where someone could disappear permanently if they weren't careful. By noon on September 17th, Tom had assembled a search team that included 2 park rangers, 3 local volunteers, and Sarah Chen, a paramedic who'd served as an Army medic before settling in Whitefish. They gathered at the trailhead parking area where Margaret's van had been, according to the GPS, just 2 days earlier. "Wheelchair tracks," announced Ranger Davis, kneeling beside the trail entrance. "Deep impressions, like someone was pushing extra weight. Trail's been disturbed recently." Rex heard them coming long before they appeared. His military training identified the sounds: multiple footsteps moving in tactical formation, radio chatter using proper communication protocols, the distinctive jingle of equipment carried by search professionals. These weren't hostile forces, but they represented a critical decision point. Rex could disappear into the forest, protecting himself and maintaining the isolation that had kept him alive for 3 years. Or he could trust these strangers with the most important mission of his life. Jacob sensed the dog's tension immediately. 2 days of shared survival had created a bond deeper than words. a partnership built on mutual dependence and growing respect. "They're looking for us, aren't they?" he asked quietly. Rex's posture confirmed it. Ears forward, body alert, but not aggressive. These were friendlies, not threats. "It's okay, boy," Jacob said, his voice carrying the authority of command despite his physical weakness. "We can trust them." When the search team reached the clearing, they found a scene that defied every assumption they'd brought with them. Jacob Mitchell sat in his wheelchair, alive and alert, his condition remarkably stable for someone who'd spent 3 days in wilderness conditions. Beside him, a massive German shepherd stood at attention, his bearing unmistakably military, despite his obvious rough living. Tom Bradley stopped dead in his tracks, recognition hitting him like a physical blow. The dog's markings, the distinctive white blaze across his muzzle, the way he held himself with professional alertness. This was the animal from JJ's photographs, the military working dog his godson had written about with such obvious affection. "Jesus Christ," Tom whispered, then louder, "Rex?" The dog's ears snapped to attention at the sound of his name, his gaze fixing on Tom with intelligent evaluation. Slowly, Rex's tail began to wag. Not the enthusiastic greeting of a pet, but the controlled acknowledgement of a soldier recognizing a fellow veteran. Sarah Chen moved forward with medical precision, her training overriding her amazement at the situation. Jacob's vital signs were remarkably stable, his hydration better than expected, his body temperature normal despite 3 nights of mountain exposure. Someone, or something, had been taking extraordinary care of him. "How?" she asked, more to herself than anyone else. "Rex," Jacob answered simply. "He's been keeping me alive." As if summoned by his name, Rex approached the medical team with calculated steps. He allowed Sarah to examine Jacob, but his positioning made it clear he was evaluating her competence. When she began checking Jacob's pressure sores, a chronic problem that had worsened during his outdoor ordeal, Rex moved closer, his nose twitching with obvious concern. "He knows," Sarah murmured in amazement. "He understands what you need medically." Tom knelt beside Rex, extending his hand palm up in the universal gesture of peaceful introduction. The dog sniffed carefully, then allowed the contact. Under the thick fur, Tom could feel the lean muscle of an animal in fighting condition despite obvious signs of extended wilderness living. "Where have you been for 3 years, boy?" Tom asked softly. "JJ looked everywhere for you before he deployed, tried to adopt you through official channels, wanted to bring you home as a surprise for his parents." Rex's response was subtle but unmistakable. A slight whine, a shift in posture that suggested grief held carefully in check. This dog understood loss, understood the weight of survivor's guilt that came with making it home when your partner didn't. The evacuation required careful coordination. Jacob's wheelchair couldn't navigate the rough trail, necessitating a stretcher carry that would take most of the remaining daylight. Rex initially resisted the separation, positioning himself between the medical team and Jacob with obvious protective intent. "It's okay," Jacob assured him, his hand finding the dog's head. "Go with them. Help them help me." Rex seemed to understand not just the words, but the concept behind them. As the team prepared Jacob for transport, Rex took point position, leading the procession with the confidence of a scout who knew every rock and root on the trail. His behavior demonstrated tactical awareness that impressed even the experienced park rangers. Halfway back to the trailhead, they encountered the complication no one had anticipated: Margaret. She stood in the middle of the trail, swaying slightly, her eyes red-rimmed and unfocused. In her hand, she clutched an empty prescription bottle, and her speech was slurred when she spoke. "I came back," she said, the words thick and difficult. Couldn't let him die alone." Tom's radio crackled with urgent chatter as Sarah rushed forward with medical supplies. Margaret had taken enough pills to be dangerous but not enough to be fatal. Yet, this was either a suicide attempt or a cry for help, and given the timing, Tom suspected it was both. Rex's reaction to Margaret was complex and heartbreaking. He approached her with obvious caution, sniffing carefully, then sat down beside her with what could only be described as deliberate compassion. Despite everything, the abandonment, the betrayal, the 3 days of protecting Jacob from the consequences of her actions, Rex seemed to understand that this woman was also suffering. "She left me to die," Jacob said quietly when Tom knelt beside the stretcher. "3 days ago, she wheeled me up here and walked away." Tom's face darkened with controlled anger, but Jacob continued before he could respond. "But she came back," Jacob added, his voice carrying a weight of understanding that surprised everyone. "Whatever she took, whatever she was planning to do to herself, she came back." That means something. As the enlarged rescue party made their way toward the parking area, Rex maintained his position between all the humans, protecting both the man who'd become his mission and the woman who'd nearly destroyed them both. His behavior suggested a wisdom that transcended species boundaries, an understanding that sometimes the greatest courage involves not just saving lives, but saving souls. The ambulance ride to Kalispell Regional Medical Center became a race against time on multiple fronts. Jacob's condition, stable during his wilderness ordeal, began deteriorating rapidly once medical intervention began. His blood pressure dropped precipitously as IV fluids revealed the true extent of his dehydration, and his kidneys showed signs of impending failure from 3 days of extreme stress. Margaret, semi-conscious from her overdose, drifted in and out of awareness in the second ambulance. During her lucid moments, she kept asking for Jacob, her voice barely audible above the sirens. "Is he alive? Please tell me he's still alive." The paramedics couldn't give her the reassurance she desperately needed. Jacob's condition was too unstable, too unpredictable. Rex had been left behind at the hospital entrance, Montana state law prohibiting animals in medical facilities except under specific circumstances. Tom Bradley stood with the distraught dog in the parking lot, watching through emergency room windows as the medical team worked frantically on both patients. Rex's agitation was palpable. He paced in tight circles, whining continuously, his military training warring with emotional attachment. "They won't let you in," Tom explained, though he wasn't sure how much the dog understood. "Hospital rules?" Rex's response was to sit down directly in front of the emergency room doors, assuming a position that clearly communicated his intention to wait regardless of regulations or time. His vigil had the unshakable quality of a soldier maintaining post, and Tom recognized the determination from his own military service. Inside the trauma bay, Dr. Jennifer Liu worked with the focused intensity that had made her the region's premier emergency physician. Jacob's labs painted a grim picture: severe dehydration, kidney dysfunction, early signs of rhabdomyolysis from muscle breakdown, and dangerous electrolyte imbalances that could trigger cardiac arrest at any moment. "How the hell did he survive 3 days in the mountains?" she muttered to her team while adjusting IV medications. "His body should have shut down completely." Sarah Chen, who'd accompanied the ambulance, provided the answer that sounded too incredible to believe. A dog, a military working dog, kept him alive, found water, provided warmth, even brought him food. Dr. Liu paused in her work, processing this information. She'd seen remarkable survival stories before, but nothing quite like this. "Where's the dog now?" "Parking lot. Won't leave. Been sitting by the doors for 6 hours. Meanwhile, in the adjacent trauma bay, Margaret's condition presented different but equally serious challenges. The toxicology report showed dangerously high levels of oxycodone combined with alcohol, a combination that should have been fatal. Her survival seemed as miraculous as Jacob's, but for different reasons. Dr. Patricia Weiss, the attending psychiatrist called for Margaret's evaluation, reviewed the case notes with growing concern. This wasn't just a medical emergency. It was the culmination of years of accumulated trauma, grief, and caregiver burnout that had finally overwhelmed a previously stable woman. "She's been drowning for 3 years," Dr. Weiss explained to Tom when he was allowed to visit. "Lost her son, watched her husband deteriorate, carried financial and emotional burdens that would break most people. What she did to Jacob wasn't evil. It was a complete psychological break." Tom struggled to accept this clinical assessment. "She left a disabled man to die in the wilderness. How is that not evil?" "Because she came back," Dr. Weiss replied simply. "She took those pills with the intention of joining him. In her mind, she wasn't abandoning Jacob, she was following him into death. The fact that she survived, that they both survived, suggests something intervened that neither of them expected. That something was currently causing a minor crisis in hospital administration. Rex had been maintaining his vigil for 8 hours when he suddenly stood, walked directly to the emergency room doors, and began pawing at the automatic sensors. His behavior wasn't aggressive or destructive, it was purposeful, intelligent, almost human in its deliberate communication. Dr. Liu, exhausted from hours of intensive care, watched through the windows as the massive dog repeated his actions with mechanical precision. "What's he doing?" "Trying to get inside," Sarah observed. "He knows his person is in here and he's not giving up." The breakthrough came when Tom remembered the documentation in JJ's military files. Rex wasn't just any dog. He was a certified military working dog with specialized training in medical detection and crisis response. More importantly, he'd never been officially retired from service, making him technically eligible for therapeutic access under veterans' medical provisions. "He has the right to be here," Tom explained to the hospital administrator with more confidence than he felt. "Veterans Therapy Animal Provisions, Military Working Dog Exception. This dog is Jacob's legitimate service animal." It took 3 phone calls to Veterans Affairs and 1 consultation with the hospital's legal department, but Rex was finally admitted as a therapeutic support animal for a veteran in crisis. His entrance into the ICU was unlike anything the medical staff had ever witnessed. Rex moved through the corridors with purpose and dignity, ignoring the curious stares and whispered conversations. When he reached Jacob's room, his behavior became even more remarkable. Rather than rushing to his patient, Rex approached slowly, carefully sniffing the air around the bed, cataloging the scents of medications, antiseptics, and illness. Jacob's eyes opened when Rex's cold nose touched his hand. The connection was immediate and profound. Both man and dog seemed to draw strength from the reunion. Jacob's heart rate, which had been irregular for hours, stabilized almost immediately. His blood pressure improved measurably. "Impossible," Dr. Liu murmured, checking the monitors repeatedly. "His vitals just normalized." Rex positioned himself beside Jacob's bed with military precision, his body providing warmth without interfering with medical equipment. His presence seemed to trigger something fundamental in Jacob's healing process, as if the will to live had suddenly been reignited by reunion with his protector. But the moment of peace was shattered when Margaret, finally conscious and coherent, appeared in the doorway supported by 2 nurses. Her reaction to seeing Rex was immediate and devastating. She collapsed to her knees, sobbing with a grief that seemed to come from the depths of her soul. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her words directed at both Jacob and Rex. "I'm so sorry for what I did to both of you." The truth began unraveling piece by piece, starting with a simple cardboard box that Tom Bradley had discovered in his garage 3 days earlier. JJ's personal effects, which the Army had shipped home 3 years ago, had remained largely untouched in Tom's storage area, while Jacob and Margaret struggled through the immediate aftermath of their loss. Inside that box, beneath folded uniforms and commendation letters, lay a manila folder marked Operation Homecoming in JJ's careful handwriting. Tom spread the contents across the hospital waiting room table while Jacob slept, and Margaret underwent psychiatric evaluation. What he found painted a picture of a young soldier's elaborate plan to surprise his parents with the most meaningful gift he could imagine: his military working dog partner, Rex. The paperwork was meticulous. JJ had spent months navigating military bureaucracy, filing adoption requests, obtaining veterinary records, and arranging transport logistics. Letters from commanding officers praised Rex's exceptional service record and recommended approval for civilian adoption. Medical evaluations documented Rex's mild PTSD symptoms, but concluded he was suitable for retirement with proper care. Most revealing was JJ's personal journal, entries dating back to his final months of deployment. Rex saved my life again today. IED buried in the road. He detected it 50 meters out, gave his alert signal, saved the whole convoy. Dad always said loyalty was the most important quality in man or beast. Rex has more loyalty in one paw than most people have in their whole bodies. Can't wait to introduce them. Dad's going to love having another Marine in the family. Another entry, dated just weeks before JJ's death. Talked to Mom on satellite phone today. Dad's been quiet since I left, spending too much time alone in his workshop. She's worried about him. Rex could help. He's got this way of knowing when someone's hurting, just sits with them until the pain passes. Military dogs are trained to detect emotional distress, but with Rex it seems deeper than training. It's like he understands suffering from the inside. The final entry was dated 3 days before the IED explosion that claimed JJ's life. Adoption paperwork finally approved. Rex ships stateside next month. Haven't told Mom and Dad yet. Want it to be a surprise. Rex is going to be perfect for Dad, especially if his back keeps acting up like Mom mentioned. This dog would walk through hell for someone he loves. Hell he already has for me. Tom read these words aloud to Jacob the next morning, watching his friend's face transform as the full scope of his son's final gift became clear. Rex, lying beside the hospital bed, seemed to understand the conversation's significance. His ears remained alert, tracking every word as if finally hearing the completion of orders he'd been carrying for 3 years. "He was coming home to us," Jacob whispered, his voice breaking. "JJ knew I needed him before I knew it myself." But the revelations didn't stop there. Dr. Weiss had completed her evaluation of Margaret, and her findings added another layer of complexity to the family's tragedy. "Your wife has been suffering from complicated grief disorder," Dr. Weiss explained to Jacob while Margaret slept in the psychiatric ward. When JJ died, she blamed herself for encouraging his military service. In her mind, her support for his deployment made her complicit in his death. That guilt, combined with 3 years of watching you deteriorate, created a perfect storm of psychological breakdown. The doctor pulled out Margaret's medical file, thick with documentation from the past 72 hours. She's been planning this for months, possibly longer. The pills she took weren't a sudden impulse. She'd been stockpiling them, calculating dosages, writing and rewriting suicide notes. In her psychological state, abandoning you in the forest wasn't murder. It was the first step in a murder-suicide pact she'd constructed entirely in her own mind. Jacob absorbed this information with the methodical patience of someone accustomed to processing traumatic intelligence. "She thought she was following me into death." Exactly. Her plan was to ensure you died first, then join you within hours. In her distorted thinking, this was an act of love, freeing you from suffering and freeing herself from the guilt of being unable to save either you or JJ. Rex had been listening to this conversation with the focused attention he'd once given to mission briefings. When Dr. Weiss finished speaking, the dog moved closer to Jacob's bed, resting his massive head on the blanket covering Jacob's legs. The gesture seemed to communicate understanding that transcended species barriers. The third revelation came from an unexpected source: Rex himself. Sarah Chen had been documenting Rex's behavior for the hospital's legal department, creating a record of his therapeutic impact on Jacob's recovery. During her observations, she noticed something remarkable about the dog's interactions with hospital equipment. Rex consistently positioned himself to avoid interfering with medical devices, demonstrated awareness of IV lines and monitoring cables, and even seemed to anticipate when nursing staff needed access to Jacob. "This isn't normal dog behavior," Sarah reported to Dr. Liu. "This is specialized medical training." Further investigation revealed that Rex had been cross-trained in medical detection work, capable of identifying seizures, diabetic episodes, and cardiac events before they became life-threatening. Military records showed he'd saved multiple soldiers' lives through early detection of medical crises during combat operations. "He kept you alive in the forest," Dr. Liu explained to Jacob, "not just through warmth and food, but through continuous medical monitoring. Your blood sugar, your heart rhythm, your respiratory patterns. He was tracking all of it, adjusting his care accordingly." This explained Jacob's remarkably stable condition during his wilderness ordeal. Rex hadn't just been providing basic survival support, he'd been functioning as a four-legged intensive care unit, using skills honed through years of military medical training. The final twist came when Margaret, finally coherent enough for extended conversation, revealed the detail that recontextualized everything. She'd known about Rex all along. "JJ called me the week before he died," she admitted to Tom, Jacob, and Dr. Weiss during a family conference. "He was so excited about surprising you with the dog. Said Rex was already trained for medical support, that he'd be perfect for helping with your recovery if your back surgery didn't go well." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Margaret had known that Rex was meant to be Jacob's companion, had understood her son's final wish to provide for his father's care. Yet when she encountered Rex at the trailhead, she'd made no connection, seen only another obstacle to her planned murder-suicide. "I was so lost in my own pain," Margaret continued, tears streaming down her face. "When I saw that dog, I didn't see JJ's gift. I didn't see hope. I only saw another living thing that would suffer because of my choices." She looked directly at Rex, who met her gaze without hostility. "I'm sorry, boy. I'm sorry I couldn't see what JJ wanted for us." Rex's response was characteristic of his nature. He rose from his position beside Jacob's bed, approached Margaret slowly, and placed his head in her lap. The gesture was deliberate, forgiving, and profoundly healing. For the first time since JJ's death, Margaret allowed herself to accept comfort without guilt. "He forgives you," Jacob observed quietly. "The question is whether you can forgive yourself." As the truth settled over the family like morning light dispelling shadows, Rex positioned himself between Jacob and Margaret's chairs, his presence bridging the gap that 3 years of grief and guilt had created. JJ's final gift wasn't just a trained dog. It was a four-legged counselor, protector, and symbol of hope that had waited 3 years to complete his most important mission, bringing his handler's family back together. The healing could finally begin. 6 months later, the morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows of the Mitchell home, illuminating a scene that would have been impossible to imagine during those dark days in September. Jacob sat at the breakfast table, his movements still careful but deliberate, spreading peanut butter on toast while Rex watched attentively from his position beside the wheelchair that now served more as backup than necessity. The physical transformation was remarkable, but not miraculous. Jacob's recovery had been slow, methodical, marked by small victories that accumulated into larger triumphs. Rex had been instrumental in every step, serving as both motivation and practical support. The dog's presence provided stability during physical therapy sessions, emotional comfort during setbacks, and unwavering encouragement when progress seemed impossible. "Ready for our morning walk?" Jacob asked, though Rex had already moved toward the door at the first sign of breakfast completion. Their daily routine had become a neighborhood fixture, man and dog moving together through the quiet streets of Whitefish, Jacob's gait improving incrementally while Rex maintained perfect pace and position. Margaret emerged from the bedroom, her hair still damp from the shower, carrying the purposeful energy of someone who had found meaning in structure. Her transformation had been more complex than Jacob's physical recovery, requiring months of intensive therapy, medication adjustments, and the slow rebuilding of self-worth that had been shattered by years of accumulated grief. "Tom called," she announced, pouring coffee into 3 mugs. The VA benefits finally came through. Full disability rating for Jacob, plus caregiver support payments. She paused, looking out the window toward Tom's house. "We can keep the house." The financial crisis that had nearly destroyed them was finally resolving. Jacob's updated disability rating, based on comprehensive medical evaluations that included his stroke-related complications, provided monthly income sufficient to cover their basic needs. More importantly, Margaret now received payment for her caregiver responsibilities, recognition that her work had always been valuable even when it felt thankless. Rex had been officially registered as Jacob's service animal, a designation that came with both legal protections and practical benefits. The dog's training costs, veterinary care, and specialized equipment were now covered by Veterans Affairs, acknowledging his role as essential medical equipment rather than pet. The community response had been overwhelming and complicated. Some neighbors viewed the family as heroic survivors, testament to the power of love and forgiveness. Others whispered about Margaret's abandonment of Jacob, questioning whether such betrayal could truly be forgiven or forgotten. The Mitchells had learned to navigate this divided opinion with grace, understanding that healing happens on different timelines for different people. Dr. Weiss continued seeing Margaret weekly. Their sessions focused on processing grief, managing caregiver stress, and developing healthy coping mechanisms. The psychiatrist had become more than a medical provider. She was a guide through the complex landscape of trauma recovery, helping Margaret understand that seeking help wasn't failure, but wisdom. "Guilt serves a purpose," Dr. Weiss had explained during one session. "It signals when our actions don't align with our values. But guilt that becomes permanent self-punishment serves no one. Jacob survived. You survived. Rex survived. Now the question is what you do with that survival." Margaret's answer had been to become an advocate for other caregivers facing similar crises. She'd started attending support groups, sharing her story with other families struggling under the weight of chronic illness and disability. Her message was simple but powerful. Asking for help isn't betrayal, and reaching the breaking point doesn't make you a monster. The legal implications of Margaret's actions had been resolved through a combination of prosecutorial discretion and community intervention. The county attorney, after consulting with medical experts and reviewing Margaret's psychiatric evaluation, declined to file criminal charges. The case was resolved through a plea agreement requiring continued psychiatric treatment and community service with veteran support organizations. Tom Bradley had been instrumental in this outcome, using his connections in the veteran community to organize character witnesses and demonstrate the family's value to their community. His advocacy had extended beyond legal support to practical assistance, organizing volunteers to help with household tasks, coordinating medical appointments, and ensuring Rex received proper training and certification. The dog's integration into their daily life had required adjustments from everyone. Rex's military training created behaviors that sometimes seemed almost supernatural to civilian observers. He anticipated Jacob's medical needs with uncanny accuracy, positioning himself to provide support before Jacob realized he needed it. During Margaret's difficult days, when depression threatened to overwhelm her progress, Rex seemed to sense her emotional state and provided comfort with the timing of a trained therapist. "He's not just a dog," Jacob often told visitors. "He's a four-legged therapist with better instincts than most humans." Rex's presence had also attracted attention from military and veteran organizations interested in his story. A documentary crew from the Veterans Affairs Department had filmed his daily routine, creating educational material about the benefits of service animals for disabled veterans. His story became part of a larger narrative about innovative approaches to veteran care and the healing power of human-animal bonds. The house itself reflected their transformation. Jacob's workshop, once a shrine to lost abilities, had been modified to accommodate his current capabilities. Adaptive tools allowed him to work with wood again, creating simple projects that provided both satisfaction and gentle physical therapy. The workshop that had once symbolized everything he'd lost now represented everything he was rebuilding. Margaret had converted JJ's bedroom into a study where she worked on her advocacy projects and attended online classes in peer counseling. The room that had been frozen in grief was now alive with purpose, honoring their son's memory through service to other military families. Rex's favorite spot was the living room, positioned where he could monitor both the front door and the activity in the kitchen. His bed was actually a custom-designed platform that allowed him to serve as a brace for Jacob when needed while remaining comfortable during long periods of watchful rest. The afternoon brought their weekly ritual, a visit to the cemetery where JJ was buried. Margaret drove their modified van while Jacob and Rex occupied the specially configured passenger area. The cemetery visits had evolved from expressions of grief to conversations with their son, updates on family progress, and community news delivered to a marble headstone that bore JJ's military honors. "Brought Rex to see you," Jacob said during their visit, his hand resting on the dog's head. "He's taking good care of us, just like you planned. Your mom's doing better, stronger than I've ever seen her. We're all healing together." Rex's behavior at the cemetery was remarkable and moving. He would sit quietly beside the headstone, his posture alert but peaceful, as if maintaining a vigil for his fallen handler. Sometimes he would place his head on the ground near the marker, a gesture that seemed to communicate grief, respect, and continuing loyalty. Margaret had begun speaking to JJ during these visits, sharing details about her therapy progress and advocacy work. "I'm helping other families avoid what we went through," she told the headstone. "Your dad says you'd be proud. Rex certainly seems to approve." The evening routine had become sacred time for the reunited family. Jacob would work on small woodworking projects while Margaret prepared dinner, and Rex moved between them, providing comfort and companionship. They'd begun eating dinner together again, something that had been impossible during the worst period of Jacob's illness. Their conversations now included planning for the future rather than merely surviving the present. They talked about home modifications that would make Jacob more independent, travel destinations accessible to disabled veterans, and Margaret's growing involvement in caregiver support organizations. "I want to write a book," Margaret announced one evening, the idea forming as she spoke. "About what we've been through, what we've learned. Maybe it could help other families recognize the warning signs before they reach the breaking point." Jacob nodded thoughtfully. "Rex's story needs to be told too. Not just what he did for us, but what JJ planned for him to do. Military working dogs don't get enough recognition for their service or their transition to civilian life." As if understanding the conversation, Rex approached Jacob's chair and performed his signature gesture, placing his massive head in Jacob's lap and looking up with intelligent amber eyes that seemed to hold all the wisdom of survival forgiveness, and unconditional love. The transformation was complete but not finished. Healing, they had learned, was not a destination but a journey, requiring daily choice to move forward rather than backward. Some days were harder than others, marked by setbacks and struggles that tested their progress. But they faced these challenges together now, understanding that strength multiplied when shared rather than hoarded. Their story had become legend in Whitefish and the surrounding veteran community, a testament to the power of love to survive betrayal, the possibility of forgiveness even after the deepest wounds, and the mysterious ways that grace can arrive wearing fur and carrying dog tags. Rex had completed his mission, the one assigned by a young soldier who understood his parents' future needs better than they had understood them themselves. The dog had brought them more than survival. He had brought them back to each other, back to hope, and back to the understanding that family bonds can endure even the most devastating tests. As the sun set over the Montana mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple, three survivors sat together in comfortable silence, watching another day end with gratitude for the gift of being alive, being together, and being home. When Jacob Mitchell was abandoned in those Montana mountains, he thought his story was over. 3 years of stroke recovery, mounting medical bills, and watching his beloved wife Margaret crumble under the weight of caregiving had convinced him that some wounds never heal. But sometimes grace arrives on 4 paws, carrying dog tags and a heart full of loyalty that transcends human understanding. Rex wasn't just any dog. He was Jacob's son's final gift, a military working dog who'd waited 3 years to complete his most important mission, bringing a broken family back together. Through Rex's unwavering devotion, Jacob discovered that healing doesn't require returning to who you were before. It means becoming who you're meant to be now. Margaret's journey from despair to hope reminds us that even our darkest moments can become the foundation for our greatest transformations. Her advocacy work now helps other caregivers find support before they reach their breaking point, proving that our pain can become our purpose. This story isn't just about survival, it's about the miracle of second chances, the power of forgiveness, and the truth that families aren't just born, they're chosen and rebuilt through love. Share your thoughts. Have you ever experienced an unexpected source of hope during your darkest hour? What role do animals play in your family's healing journey? We'd love to hear your stories in the comments below.